Thanks for tuning in again, everyone. Hopefully you've had a chance to have a quick look at the poll that's up there. I'm going to leave it up there for just another second or so for everyone who's not yet had a click there. That's the poll or the question that I threw out to you last time, that we didn't have the poll ready for that. So hopefully that's allowed you to exercise your thoughts that you had last time and share a little bit. I'll have a bit of discussion about that in a moment, share the answers so that everyone can have a bit of a laugh and a giggle at what other people's organisations tend to be like. Now, we will recap for a moment just the admin, the basics and things to think about. So let me just close the poll and we'll come back to that in just a moment. Sorry, folks. Just got to make sure that our screen sharing is working correctly. Let me just share the poll whilst I get the screen sharing working for you, so you can see the results that are up there. You can see that if the bottom answer is meant to be probably the ideal answer, the preferred answer, the one we'd all probably like to say, then really only about half of us are in organisations where we feel confident that the organisation has the ideal view or perspective on things. Now, I think that if you look at the rest of them, there's some there that are probably having a more cynical view where, like, for example, mechanism for management to interfere, we've only got about 7%. So, there's not a lot of people that are in that situation. The 9% there, fancy name for administrative overhead. To a lot of people, the program management, a lot of things are expected of us in program management. There's a lot of things that go on that do place demands upon other parts of the organisation or upon the projects or things that happen in relation to project delivery. And sometimes it's not clear exactly what benefit that brings or why that's leverageable or why that's useful to something else. And I think that part of these sorts of discussions and these sorts of short courses, it hopefully gives an idea for those in the organisation that are perhaps less aware of the true nature of the way in which program management has this sometimes disconnected leverage between all of the details of reports and what seems to be overhead, bureaucracy, administration, and how that seems to just get in the way of getting things done. But in the case of strategic decision making, there are essential contributors that come together to make sure that at the end of the day, the biggest, most important decisions at the top of the tree get made with the right and the most useful information. If we look also at the resources question, 13% have said a method of managing vast resources. For a lot of organisations, it's the management of those resources is the most critical aspect. They've got so many contributors to what needs to happen that there needs to be some ways to strategically handle all those to make sure they're all contributing. And although it might appear to be primarily about these vast resources, in reality it is often an effective program management component because it is a way of trying to bring all of these disparities into a cohesive strategic objective. And then of course we've got the 20% that are saying, well, we probably could do a better job at this. We sort of know that we should be and we kind of have an idea of it, but we really would like to know more about it. But the interesting stat for me is to say that, well, there's 50% of organisations that you're all a part of probably could do it better and in some cases could do it significantly better. So let me hide that and see if I have actually managed to fix my screen sharing. There we go. And I apologise that it's a slightly different shape today. Now, first of all, we're going to just recap the basics really quickly. Housekeeping. Obviously, the questions box, most of you would be familiar with that by now. That's the place in the panel where you're going to put any of your questions, your information, any comments, anything you like. Throw it in there. We'll address it as we go. Those of you who haven't had a good look at the online course portal, please do so. You'll find the recordings up there. Last week's webinar recording will be there. There's pre-recorded audio lectures that are put up there each week. We're going to actually see if we can get those uploaded a little earlier next week so that you have them a little bit more in advance. There's also some study guide information, the slide deck and things like that up there. You'll also find some discussion forums. There's places there for people that have already put a couple of questions up. That's where if anything doesn't get addressed or doesn't get answered for you during any of these webinars, that's the place to go and put your thoughts, put your comments, and also have a look and see if anyone else has asked a question that you might be able to contribute to. And as I mentioned, the webinar recordings will be found up there as well at the portal. Now, for those of you who are struggling with the size of the screen layout, that's something that's not able to be fixed at the moment. I'm hoping that's visible. Let me ask Ben. Can I ask you? Are you able to see that? Okay, is it actually readable for you, Ben?
It is, but I do need to stretch it across the entire width of my screen, and then I can see.
Okay, but it is stretchable, is it?
Yeah, in the bottom right-hand corner, there should be the corner bit where you can drag it the whole way across.
You can drag it down to expand it. Okay, yeah. So, all right. So this is a function of having some different hardware here at the moment. So the recording will capture all of this information correctly. So you'll be able to see it in detail. Those of you who are only seeing black is because you're only seeing a part of the left. If you expand it completely, you might be able to see the whole thing. So the other basic information that we covered last week, we talked just a recap of that. The people involved, we've got myself and Philip Hosking, who will be giving you the discussion this evening. The admin team, of which Ben is part of that, and James, who you met last week, who are behind the scenes making sure everything works smoothly. They're the people that you would contact via email if you have any issues accessing anything. And of course, this is run by IT Masters and Charles Sturt University. The interaction we've already talked about, the learning portal, that's the primary place to go. That's where you'll find everything you need. There is an assessment which will be in week 5, which we'll talk about in week 4, give you a bit more of a clue as to what to expect with all of that. And of course, as we've already mentioned, there are pre-recorded audio files. There are study guide, which is sort of pointers, questions, things to think about with each topic as we go. There are suggestions of what portions of the textbooks to read, but the textbooks are not included. They're not part of the accessible material for this particular short course. They are for the main full subject, but they're not. So what we're really going to be talking about tonight is constraints. And we're going to talk about some specific ones. And obviously those of you who've had a bit of familiarity with project management will look at this and say, well, look, there's a couple missing out of this. There's what about risks? What about scope? Well, those things are covered in the full course. We have to keep something up our sleeve to keep the rest of it interesting. So this topic tonight is going to talk specifically about some of these other constraints or these other resource-based constraints that are looked at by program management a little differently. It's perhaps a little bit easier to think of programs as having to deal with risk in a different way. And it's perhaps a little more obvious to say, well, okay, if the project scope is at the project level, well, program scope is the bigger picture. But it's a little less certain exactly how the programs might look differently at some of these things. So we're going to talk a bit about time, and time is one of these interesting resources and constraints because it's that one thing we just can't get any more of. We can't purchase it. The only way we can get time is to borrow it from something else. So, we have heard that saying that we've got all the time there is. Time is something we can't just convert some other resource to get more of it. And the time that we have, it keeps ticking, it gets used up, whether we make any use of it, whether we convert that time into value or not. It still evaporates, it still disappears. And this creates some unique pressures on us to make sure that when we actually are managing the time resource, we sometimes have different pressures at the program level because we are dealing with the clashes of scheduling and time constraints and pressures that occur from multiple different projects. This can require some fairly complicated planning. Cost, of course, on the one hand, cost can seem a little bit simpler, certainly more simple than time might be, but there's some elements about cost that come into play at the program level that are a little bit different. Issues like the fact that when you're talking about significant amounts of money, and a lot of large programs often do have much higher budgets, money costs money to have. It costs money for it to be lying around waiting. It costs money for it to be invested in anything, and especially if that something is yet to return any investment, to yield any value on that money. So given that programs often take a period of time, they are also at the program level handling the contingencies and reserves for a period of time. So if you can imagine, a contingency might be something that it has to be applied to multiple different projects. You know, it could be something that might be borrowed from one project and applied to another. And only the program level can effectively do that sort of thing. And we'll talk a little bit about the difference between budget and cash flow and funding, etc. We'll also have a little bit of a chat about quality, and we talk a bit about what it specifically is, that it's about suitability. And you know, in the pre-recorded audio, I gave the example of it. It's not like a cup of coffee where you can have a high-quality cup of coffee or a low-quality cup of coffee. It's about whether it satisfies the need at the time. And you know, I'm sure we've all had plenty of cups of coffee that, you know, they really weren't the best coffee we've ever had, but they did the job at the time. And there's an element of that analogy that comes into play. But, you know, quality is a little bit special because if we fail to get quality right, if we fail to make quality achieve its goals and objectives, we can often have a situation where the entire program or large sections of the program can fail. And there's some other resources that, you know, sort of fall into this same category. And, you know, we talk a little bit about human capital. And whilst human resources aren't one of the classic constraints, they are the sorts of thing that gets dealt with a little bit differently, and often very differently depending on the organization. So looking at time management specifically, I mean, part of the problem that we have with programs is the amount of time that we need to wait before things mature, before results are identified, let alone actually realized. And we have this scenario where in time management we need to have some image of the future and how it's going to look at the end before we can really come back to the very beginning and map out what the earliest elements of our schedule need to look like. The issue is a lot to do with the interdependence that goes on between time and scheduling. And I've known programs, and I'm sure that this is something that Philip will touch on a bit later, but I've known programs where the biggest headache has been the schedule. It's been juggling all of these clashes and conflicts of schedule because many different aspects of what we're needing to deal with have their own particular scheduling issues. For example, the availability of key resources will have one scheduling set of restrictions. It'll be only available in certain ways at certain times, and that resource might be some equipment, it might be key people, etc. But then you'll also have scheduling issues regarding a particular project, one component of the program, and it might only have certain points in its schedule where that resource is going to be needed. And then that might conflict with this other component project over here, which for other scheduling reasons is only going to have access to or only going to be able to use that resource at certain times. And this is just on a resource basis. Then you've got other scheduling kinds of conflicts and challenges where project C might need or rely upon something that's coming from project A, but project C needs it by a certain time in order to meet its deadlines, but project A can't deliver it until, well, hopefully before then. And this is something that we have to figure out at the program level. So the complexities can be enormous when it comes to juggling and managing time. One of the consequences of this is that the schedule itself ends up evolving as the projects and as the program evolves. So there's only a certain amount of planning and scheduling and time planning we can do up front. There's only a certain amount that we can say, well, okay, here is exactly how things are going to pan out. We then need to be able to have ways in which we can be flexible with how that schedule evolves, but taking into account the ever-increasing complexity of the consequences, the flow-on, the domino effect of what's going to happen with any particular change in the schedule. So if something changes partway through and this project now needs something earlier, or can make use of something earlier, and we bring that in earlier, well then what other consequence does that have for some other project? These are all the sorts of things that in program management we've got to juggle all these different balls in the air. But generally we're only going to worry about the biggest milestones. We're going to be looking and focusing on the most important. And when we talk about milestones, one of the key elements of what milestones are all about is their purpose is to drive decision making. So milestones are a key point at which a decision needs to be made. And so when we reach milestones, the purpose is to then gather the information that needs to be taken into account at that point and make the decision that's associated with that milestone about how we then proceed. And sometimes a milestone is like a phase gate milestone. It's a case of, well, do we continue or do we not continue? And it can be that drastic. But sometimes it's a case of saying, well, look, here's a milestone relating to our schedule, and here is where we stop and look and say, well, this, and this have to be at these stages of progress. And if they're not, then decisions need to be made about what to do about it. So this is where we link the milestones with the decisions, and this is where we link the milestones with the information that leads and feeds into those decisions. And at the program level, we're looking at the biggest milestones. We're looking at the milestones that bump into other projects. So in each particular project, we will look for and look at the milestones that are relevant or cause relevance for some other project. But it means we need to be aware as best we can of where things not only are a problem right now, but also where they might suddenly go wrong. Where the scheduling is just too tight, where we've created a scenario that if it doesn't work out precisely as we've planned, then the consequences may be significant. And yes, this is a risk element. We are saying, well, look, we're talking about scheduling risks. But scheduling risks can be some of the most painful because it doesn't take more than a small misalignment of scheduling and sequencing to have something that's dependent upon something that isn't available, and then as a consequence of that, enormous amounts of elapsed time might be lost or wasted. So in the program context, we really need to be on top of the scheduling elements on a fairly regular basis. We need to be constantly looking at what the traps and pitfalls of the scheduling clashes might cause. We need to be looking at the scheduling interdependencies regularly. And as the quote says, another day, another schedule check. It's one of the most constant, most common kinds of investigations that the program management is going to need to do. Because if there is a potential time bomb, a potential conflict coming up, then lead times in doing something about it ahead of time is precious. It's something we really have to be able to work with. And as Benjamin Franklin has been quoted as saying, that you might delay, but time will not. Time stops for no one. Now, just on regards to these slides, I just want to let everybody know that the slide deck is already available in the portal. So if you want to, you can just hop onto the portal now and download the PDF, and you'll be able to scroll through the PDF and be in sync with everything that we're saying, even if you're not able to see it to live online. When we get to the next poll, I'll let you know, and you can switch screens over to that. So anyone who wants to be able to grab the PDF, just pop onto the Learning Portal now, and you'll be able to pull down that PDF in a few moments and have a look through it and do it that way. That might be easier for some of those who can't quite see it properly at the moment. And yes, we'll have that working a little bit better for you next week. It's just that it's not something we can troubleshoot in the midst of it all right now. So moving along, talking a little bit about cost. There's some elements about cost and money in general at the program level that's a little bit different. I want to talk about some differences between some of the terminology because it's helpful to understand that some of the ways in which program management looks at money is a little bit different to what can happen at the project level. A lot of the time, the project level can have a simpler view of what goes on with the money. It's sort of money in, money out. So, the issue of budget is an intention. A budget is a plan. And as we know with most plans, they're kind of variable, they're kind of flexible. It's not yet set in stone until it's already happened. Expenditure is the actual event. It's the actual spending of money. So you can look at budget as being the intention and expenditure as being the actual, but cash flow is the timing of all of this. So cash flow, you can have cash flow timed and planned in a budget. You plan to spend this money at this point, and you plan to spend it then. But when you actually spend it is also relevant and important. When it comes to costs and the ability to have these adjustments to say, well, okay, we've planned for this budgeting, but the expenditure is a little bit different. Program management is in a unique position, sitting above the projects, to manage all of this in a slightly different way. Within the individual project, there's not as much that the project can do when it perhaps needs to change the expenditure. It needs a bit more money for this, but might have a bit left over for that. Or it needs this money paid a bit earlier than this money paid late. Program management has the opportunity to have that sort of balancing act, managing the buffers across a number of programs, a number of projects in general. Because money is something that's always intrinsically shared across all of the components or the projects or everything that is contributing to the ultimate goal and objective of the program. So the program is this big, grand goal, this big result at the end. And the money, the funding, is usually, initially at least, associated with those results. So in the business case scenario for the program, the business case discussion is going to be about, well, we're going to have this great, fantastic thing at the end. And yes, that's going to be managed by a program, and yes, it'll be made up of lots of individual projects. But the money in the earliest decision is associated with the big result at the end. And it's then subsequently associated individually, compartmentalized down to the individual projects. So that's usually a second step, which means what any particular project gets in terms of financial resources is only a portion of this bigger picture. And the responsibility for making sure that what is spent in total and whether or not that is value for money for what is achieved at the end, that is always the program's responsibility. So whilst projects are often just looking at, dollars and cents and getting receipts for things, and well, how much did we spend, and could we do that cheaper, and have we spent all our money yet, or have we got extra? Programs look at the management of the larger sum of money, which means that when a larger sum of money is agreed upon, even though it's not necessarily all made available up front, the timing of when that becomes available is important and relevant to the program's planning. Because, as we said before, money costs money. So if we're going to invest a whole bunch of money in something, well, once it gets spent on something in the project, or machinery or equipment or personnel, etc., it's already been spent. And there's always this delay between when you've spent the money on something and when it starts to yield some return. Now, most people with an accounting background or who are familiar with those who look after the finances, most of them will know that you want to spend that money as late as you possibly can. You want to be doing other things with it. At the very least, you want to have it in the bank because then you're earning some interest on it. And there's usually far more creative things to do with that money. And when it's vast amounts of money, those amounts that you get out of that can be quite significant. So program management has this burden of managing the cost of each transaction, the cost of putting the money out there at a particular point in time. Program management therefore has to think in terms of opportunity costs. If we spend this money now on this project to do this thing and have it early or on time, well, that's something else that we can't do with that same amount of money. And these prioritization decisions get made at the program level because two projects are never going to really agree, two project managers are never going to agree as to who should get the early allocation of funds. But then once the money goes in that particular direction, you've then got sunk costs. You've then got the phenomenon that says, well, we've made an irretrievable investment there. And by irretrievable, I mean, it could be something that if you decide to pull it out, you might get something back out of that expenditure, but you're probably not going to get most of it, and you might not get very much at all. So then these factors play into the decision making at the program level. Say, well, look, we've already gone down this path, so if we try and pull out of that, it's going to cost us more in the long run. Now, project X over here, who's got nothing to do with that, is very happily delivering on time and on budget, completely unaware, that project Y next door is in dire straits and has got budgetary issues where not enough was allowed for, money has been sunk into something that's not delivering results or not now expected to deliver results. We've got money that's been sunk into something, and we could have spent it on something else, but we didn't. This is all stuff that the program management has to deal with and make decisions on. And sometimes that means that they go over to Project X and say, well, that extra buffer fund that we said you could have, you can't. We're going to have to put it on Project Y because that's gone out of control. Now, ideally, we'd love to be able to say, look, we should have just estimated better, right? We should have just worked it out in advance, and we should have just said, okay, well, let's just do our estimating a little better, and we won't get into these troubles, right? Well, that doesn't work effectively in most programs because of the enormous delay between when the initial planning is done and when the ultimate results are achieved. And the longer you have and the more uncertainties you introduce through that period, the less accurate your initial estimating is going to be. So a lot of the time programs rely on order of magnitude estimating that says, well, look, we know it's going to be between this and this. It's going to be of that. It's going to be several thousand. It might be, like between 5,000 and 8,000. Well, that's quite different from being between 50 and 80,000. That's an order of magnitude difference. We might say, what's it going to be? What's going to be within these brackets? And that gives an idea of what the budgeting needs to be. But of course, reality then comes along and says, well, here's what it actually cost. And we start to see over time, as the actual expenditure unveils, how close or not it was to those order of magnitude budget expectations. And the nuances of where they do and don't match up is what program management needs to be able to deal with. Of course, we all want things to be cheaper. We all, as William Shakespeare said, fashion of the world is to avoid costs. It's all about avoiding unnecessary costs. And yes, that is a part of what program management is there to do. But it's only half of what program management is there to do. Certainly program management is there to manage the costs, but it also needs to be spending enough in order to get the results that are needed at the end. So linking this to the bigger issue of finance, we've said already that money costs money. The principle that any money that gets allocated to something, until such time as it is yielding a return, that money is costing. That expenditure is costing. And at the lowest levels of measuring money, at the project level, at the work parcel level, we're looking at value for effort. The equation of saying, well, we have this amount of money spent on this, we have this amount of time spent on this, we have this amount of resources spent on this, and what kind of effort do we get out of it? What kind of value comes from that effort? But at the higher level, at the program level, we're looking at return on investment. It's about saying, well, we've spent $1.5 million on this. What's it going to do for our business? What benefit is it going to bring on a far more holistic sense? And that extrapolation of saying, well, we're looking at value for effort on a small scale, wrapping that up into a bigger picture that says, and what does this mean in terms of benefits and return on our investment? That extrapolation, that understanding is program management's job. Because, as we said before, the funding at the business case end of the spectrum, the funding decisions are aligned with the big picture, the big benefits and rewards of the program. And the funding provider is the one that's expecting to see those rewards, those ultimate benefits. So often, in a financial sense, programs have some degree of accountability to whoever is putting up the money. Now, quite often, that's also the customer, but not always. Sometimes the customer is the beneficiary of what this program is going to deliver. But the funding might be a dedicated funding, it might be a bank, or it might be a number of banks, or something similar. It might be a parent organisation, someone that the beneficiary has borrowed from. But they're a stakeholder now, because they want to see that what they've put forward the money for yields the results that the beneficiary or the customer ends up enjoying, so that the customer can service that loan requirement. Sometimes this means that the funding providers, whoever is putting up the money, is empowered to make some or contribute to some big decisions within the program. Because as this expenditure is incremental, because we're not going to just put all the money up front, we're going to spend it as we need it, it creates this situation of phase gates, these financial funding moments that say, well, look, hang on, should we really be continuing to invest in this direction? Are we seeing a situation where we're going to get suitable value for this investment? Are we seeing a trend of spending more than we expected? And is this going to yield the results we want? So phase gates are sort of these go and no-go decisions, these major fundamental decisions on the program. And funding providers often have a lot of influence over those. Because whether or not the funding continues and how and in what way is linked to the perception that the benefits will be realized, that at some point it'll yield a return that's going to make all of this investment worth it. Jules Renard was a French writer in the 19th century, I believe, and one of his more famous quotes was saying that I finally know what distinguishes man from other beasts, which is financial worries. So I think that was meant in jest, but it was meant as satirical perhaps, to say that it's a very human thing to worry about financial returns on anything, but especially programs. So here's a poll. I'll throw this poll up for you to have a think about. You can answer it right away. This one actually is a real poll that's going to work. Which of these constraints, in your experience, in your organisation, and you sort of already had a bit of a think about how your organisation approaches these things, but which of these constraints are people most concerned about? Is it all about money? Is everyone asking, worried about money? Is everyone really focused on the quality of the outcome and the results? Are people really focused on when? Is everyone living in their scheduling and living in their diaries? Is it all about the people and people power and who gets what and who's available and who has control, etc.? Or is it about people watching their backs and covering their butt and making sure that they don't get the blame for when it inevitably goes horribly wrong, etc.? Where do people think? We've got about 50% voted so far. I'll wait till we get a little bit higher for everyone who's thinking about it, and then we'll share the results straight away and give you a view of what everyone's thinking. 60% voted. I'll get it up. Hopefully get up to about 75, and I'll close the poll if we can. Now, some of you are obviously thinking, oh, look, really it's sort of it's a draw between this and that, and you'd love to be able to click more than one answer, but unfortunately it's, all or nothing. You've got to pick one result. All right, so we've got more than 3/4 voted now, so I'll close that and I'll share it with you all. Have a look at this. This is interesting. This is interesting. Here you go. You've got 33% have said that it's all about the money. Financially driven organizations, 1/3 of you have said that really money is what most people seem to be concerned about, not spending too much. So clearly you've got a financially driven decision-making process in that kind of organization that has created this subculture of people focusing more on how much things cost rather than the value that is necessarily achieved from that, although you can't really separate those two. But a focus about money obviously means that some of the other things are less important. Now the next one is probably the most interesting result from this poll, and that is that only 3% have said that quality is what matters most, the quality of the outcome. getting it done right, getting the right result. 3% have said that that's the most important factor. Well, we're going to talk about quality in the program sense in a moment, so we'll bring that into context there. 31% have said that it's all about times, schedules. That's nearly a third. Have said it's all about time. There's obviously a lot of time pressure of getting things done. Moving on to the next thing usually is where the time pressure comes from. 7% have said human resources. A relatively small number that have said that it's all about, I mean, as we said before, human resources are not one of the big classical constraints, but I've thrown them in there just to broaden the discussion a little bit. And 26%, so about a quarter, have said that it's more about risk, fault, and blame. So it's more about really what might go wrong and how that might impact things. Interesting set of numbers there. So let's talk a bit about quality. And I'll shape a more classical, more altruistic view of where quality should sit in a lot of program thinking. What is program quality, first of all? What's it really all about? Well, I cover this in a little bit of detail in the pre-recorded audio file, but it's about suitability for purpose. Quality has a very explicit and specific meaning in the project and program world. And it's not about the grade of something. It's not about the comparison of something to something like it. It's about just whether or not it does the job. Suitability. So taking that view, when you look at it from the program point of view, it's about making sure that things are suitable across multiple different projects. And that having one project meet a certain quality standard or deliver something suitable might be something that another project is entirely dependent upon. Now, you may not have projects in a construction sense where, you know, one project is to build the foundation and the other project is something on top. But you're going to have scenarios where a highway, a major freeway, which we've talked about as an example in the past, the project to build a tunnel and making sure the tunnel is wide enough and high enough is going to be pretty important to the ability for the rest of that roadway to carry the kinds of traffic that is needed to be delivered across that road. So when you're talking about signage that occurs elsewhere along the highway, well, you'd kind of expect that it's going to allow for the same degree of height clearance that is going to be relevant at the tunnel. Now, this is an example of where quality at the program level is essential to make sure that if you're looking for a higher objective, which is to enable certain kinds of traffic to get from A to B down this highway, then quality expectations have to be managed across all of the sub-projects. But quality, just like we talked about budget, you've got the estimates of saying, well, look, you know, budget is something that we can only estimate in the beginning within certain orders of magnitude. Quality can have very similar challenges because you say, well, you know, we know that we need a roadway through here that's going to be able to carry this kind of traffic. But you get into certain areas of construction and you find that one particular area has subsiding land space and the land itself is collapsing, it's sand or something, and it won't support the load without another level of work that needs to be done to provide supporting structure to make sure that it can carry the big trucks that need to go across it. Now, the expectations of saying, well, we need these trucks to use this road, that hasn't changed. But the quality statement of what it's going to take to achieve that quality, what is suitable, what constitutes a suitable piece of road at that particular location, that has changed, that has evolved. But ultimately, the way we look at quality, the way we measure and assess quality is linked to what we've talked about value. We talked about value at the smaller scale. Yes, the word still applies when you're looking at value in terms of benefits on the larger strategic scale. But value is something that can be measured in smaller increments and then extrapolated up to ensure that the accumulated value of all of these different components all works together. To be able to achieve this, you need these two fundamental elements of dealing with quality. One is quality assurance, and the other is quality control. And they have slightly different emphasis. Quality assurance is sort of the proactive elements of what we're doing to make sure that quality is achieved the first time. It's about getting it right the first time. It's about making sure. It's about the decisions, the plans, the standards, and the checking to make sure that when we do something, we have achieved the quality requirements straight out of the gate. And then you've got quality control, which is about the removal of doubt. So quality assurance says that we're going to do everything we can to get it right the first time. And quality control says, yeah, but we're also going to make sure that in case we don't, A, we know about it, and B, we're going to do something about it. So control is the absence of uncertainty. It's the absence of risk that says, well, yeah, we tried very hard to get it right, and we hope it is, but we just don't know. That's not quality control. Quality control deals with that. So quality control is saying, well, yeah, look, we think the bridge will take that kind of load weighting, but, you know, we're not too sure. Quality control is making sure. Quality has this very interesting aspect to it as one of the major constraints, and that is that it can be the thing that really makes or breaks the entire program. So if you compare it, for example, to saying, well, look, you know, we might be 10% late, or we might be 10% over the budget, and really that's a 10% problem, and that's, you know, bad, okay. But what if it's 10% useless? If it just can't do the job, that might actually not be 10% useless. That might be 100% useless. That might translate to a 100% over budget because it's 100% useless. It can't do the job. It isn't going to achieve the benefits. So quality as a constraint, as a requirement at the program level has this awesome power to potentially completely devalue everything that's been done, all of the different component projects. You could have some projects that have delivered perfect quality results, on time, on budget, all singing, all dancing, full of bells and whistles, and a terrific result. And the other project next to it that was needed in parallel for the ultimate program results has, for whatever reason, failed dismally. Well, that can mean that the program benefits aren't realized and the program has failed. Aristotle quoted as saying, quality is not an act, it is a habit. It is constant, it is intended and meant to permeate everything. And in the program environment, we need quality to be a habit. We need it to be intrinsic to everything that's going on so that everything that is done to the required standard in the right way to meet the required purpose. Now I'm going to pause and see if we've got any comments or questions to see if everyone's been able to tune in to any of that. Let me see if we've got a few people here that have got some comments. We've got a comment here from Darryl saying, he's saying, where I work, there's a lot of talk about project management, but no discussion on program or portfolio management. He says, I think it's assumed that the managers do this naturally as a part of their job. I've encountered this a lot, actually, in my experience, that project management seems to be something that, you know, everyone's a little bit more familiar with, comfortable with, and we kind of know that sort of stuff needs to happen. But at what point does program management or portfolio management need to happen? And why and how? That's a lot less clear to a lot of organizations. And a lot of the time, there's this sort of hidden assumption that, well, it's just like project management, only bigger, right? Well, in some ways, there is elements of truth to that in terms of a thought paradigm, in terms of an attitude and a mindset. There are certainly similarities to how you would go about tackling some of these things. But there are different perspectives, there are different challenges, there are different aspects to it that need to be tackled a little bit differently. Harpreet's asking, can we explain again about the difference between quality assurance and quality control? Let me try and put it in a different paradigm. Quality assurance is investment in proactively trying to make sure that we get it right the first time. It's being assured that when investment of time, effort, and resources is made, it will come out at the other end at the required level of quality. So things that go into quality assurance are things like, well, for example, knowing what standards are required, having the right skills, the right people, the right resources, that sort of thing involved in that picture, and saying, well, our quality assurance says these are all the things that we're going to do to make sure that the quality results we get are not by accident. They are deliberate and they are intended, and that's what we're aiming for. That's quality assurance. The quality control says, yeah, but what if we miss our target? What if that's not exactly, I mean, that's a great intention, but what if it doesn't quite work? Is that going to be a problem? Well, in some cases, yes. In some cases, in some situations, not having the quality, even though we think we tried very hard, it can be catastrophic. We have to know for sure. So quality control is the absence of any uncertainty as to whether or not quality assurance has achieved what was expected of it. So quality control comes along and says, well, we're going to test this. I'm going to test that. I'm going to test. And out of that testing, answers will come back and say, well, actually, all these are good. You know, these have all met the requirements. So this and this hasn't. Now, two things come out of quality control at this point. Firstly, these outcomes that are perhaps in some way substandard, they're going to need to be fixed in some way. They're going to need to be worked on. Something's going to need to be done about that. And secondly, there might need to be some changes made to our quality assurance to make sure that those things, those failures, don't keep happening. Now, sometimes it's unique. Sometimes it's one-off failures. And we don't need to change the process. But sometimes a failure of quality can be detected as being systematic. Simple thing like somebody in particular is producing work that's not of the right quality simply because they weren't sufficiently aware of what was expected of them. And so you go back into your assurance and you say, you make sure that Fred and Mary know that they're meant to do it this way, and then it'll be okay. So hopefully that elaborates on the explanation for you of exactly what the difference is between those two. Let's look if we've got any other question. What else we got? Now, Sajid's got a quote about scope constraint, which I think I've possibly lost the context of that, the question about scope constraint. Let me ask you, Sajid, if you could elaborate on that for us, about what you meant in terms of the scope constraint question. If you're referring about why we're not talking about scope constraint, it's only because we've only got 4 topics available to us. All right, let's move on a little bit further. Pardon me a second. So keep thinking about your questions. We'll tackle a few more in a little while. We're also going to have a bit of questions after we've heard from Philip shortly. So anything that we haven't covered already at that point, we'll be able to cover then. So I have mentioned that we've thrown in the human element as part of all this to broaden the discussions. The program approach to the human element is fairly crucial in most situations, because when you have skills and resources that are underutilized, in most situations they have a cost associated with it. And we talk about human capital, and most of us have heard the phrase human capital, because when you invest in humans, in most cases in terms of employees, costs, there are a certain amount of fixed overhead costs that you can't escape. So whether that person actually contributes and is productive and efficient on an ongoing basis, or whether they sit around playing cards or checking Facebook all the time, or just got nothing to do, so they're unproductive. Well, they're not productive enough in their environment. That's a wasted resource. It's an underutilized resource. That's a loss of value. Now, what the program management is looking at is key resources, crucial resources. And in the pre-recorded audio, I gave the example of like the key engineers, the architects that are responsible, the civil engineers that are responsible for making key decisions throughout our highway construction would be key people. People that are idle or people that are overutilized. You also have the flip side of this problem where you have people that are meant to be in 2 places at once. And that's if they're lucky, because some people are meant to be in 3. And program management is meant to avoid that, and when it's looming or when it occurs, fix it and deal with it. Ring up Project A and say, well, look, Fred's not coming today because he's busy on Project B, sorry. You can have Mary instead. There's also human resource policies and procedures, and a lot of this will flow down from the organization as a whole, because if you're talking about projects and programs that are being run by one organization, usually HR policy is being handled at the organizational level. And that'll translate down to be managed at the program level in some cases, or some portions of it will be. So you'll have commonalities of the nature of the arrangement of rewards and incentive schemes and remuneration and such things as annual leave. The control of that might shift to program management, precisely so that the program management can deal with availability of skills and human resources to ensure that you don't have all 3 of your key engineers taking a holiday at the same month. Now, if they were allocated to different projects, you could see how that could feasibly occur. But at the program level, it's the managing of the availability of human resources and human capital in terms of their skills, their experience, their knowledge, and their workforce capability. But similarly, the external resources, the people that are outside of the internal workforce, the non-employees, these are perhaps gap fillers. These might be used where if you do have skill shortages or labour shortages in certain situations, you might supplement those by engaging external resources to fill the gap. Again, this is decision-making that is really only effective at the program level. And this can create or require certain relationships and certain contracts with certain providers, perhaps even individuals, or perhaps organizations who are providing human-based skills, expertise, resources into the program to be used in certain projects. And those relationships might best be handled, and should generally be handled, at the relationship level. And often that is a bit like the fact that an employee has a legal relationship with the organization that's employing it. Similarly, an outsourced third party will have a legal contract with the organization that's it's contracted to, which isn't any one particular project, but might be managed by the program. So that no matter which project those resources or people might be involved with, they have the one relationship, and they don't have to renegotiate everything and start from scratch just because they're working somewhere different down the line. John F. Kennedy was quoted as saying the human mind is a fundamental resource. He was, in this context, he was talking about expenditure of spending money on education, which is what he was talking about in this sense. But it's a fairly generic, relevant philosophy that says that people and what they know and what they can know and can do and can think is a fundamental resource, and often an underutilized one or undermanaged one in many situations. Now, before we flip over and have a listen to Philip, whom we'll open the microphone to in a moment, I just want to check and see if there are any other questions or anything. I've got a question from Talika as asking about how is QA/QC related to M&E. I want to ask you to just elaborate for everyone what you mean by M&E in that regard, and we'll cover that question in a few moments. Now, don't seem to have many other questions there, so I want you to encourage you to all have a think about what Philip's going to be covering in a few moments. We'll come back to Talika's question shortly. But let me hand over to Philip. We are going to try again to pass the keyboard control to him in this way, so we'll see if that works this time. Philip, you with us today?
Absolutely.
Fantastic. All right, my friend, let me see if I can successfully pass you keyboard and mouse.
Okay.
Right. Give it a try.
Okay. Thank you. All I can say is I wish I was in Singapore now because it is freezing in Melbourne right now. So we're about, it's about 11 degrees or something at the moment. But that aside, thank you, Brenton. The information that you've given leads in nicely to the bits I'm going to talk about. You see the title of my discussion is Program Controls. What I'm really talking about and focusing on is business controls that should be in place to drive strategy. So we're talking about strategy when we're talking about success, and when we're talking about programs and portfolios, we're really referring here to the business outcomes linked to the strategy. So I'll be talking about these things. I won't be, for example, talking about how we're tracking actual versus forecast, how we're looking at triple constraint. I won't be talking about those types of things in this session. Tonight I'll be talking about program controls. Next week, portfolio management controls. And then in our final night together, I'll be talking about governance controls. So these are the elements that we need to help drive strategy through to success. One way to look at the checklist of things that I'm going to talk about tonight is to think of it, for example, if you're coming in doing an audit. One of the things that I find interesting in audits is you get these young whippersnippers coming in, and they have this list that they use for absolutely every type of project or program or portfolio, and they rattle it through and they say, do you have it, yes or no? What we really need to think about when I'm talking about some of these things, and they are summarized, by the way, I'm not going into a lot of detail, but when we're doing a checklist or going through an evaluation, there are a few things we need to think about. One is, are they actually there? Do they exist? Can you put your hands on them? Are they appropriate for the type of program, the risk profile of the program or the portfolio that we're dealing with? Are they being used? And if they are being used, are they effective? Now, those sorts of questions are much better when you start to get into checklists and audit and I guess control measures for driving through success. Now, speaking of success, let me see. I'm going to do a down arrow here, and hopefully I go to the next slide. Yes, it worked. I was saying to Brenton the other day, it might have been a senior moment on my behalf. I think I was probably clicked in another screen, or I may have hit the wrong arrow button. All right, so I'm going to talk about 5 fundamental program controls to help drive business strategy to success. I'm drawing my information from an organization called Totally Optimized Projects, or TOP. You can look them up in the website, TOP, and they spell optimized with a Z. So I'm drawing the information and I guess inspiration and summarizing of these things from that source. So I want to acknowledge that as we go through tonight. And one final thing, I guess, before I go, I find the short courses really interesting because there is so much we want to talk about, so much detail we'd love to go into, but we're just unable to in a short course. And I guess that's where the detailed courses go into a lot more. So probably each one of these slides would be an entire session. But let's see how we go. So what are the 5 things I'm going to talk about tonight? I'm going to talk about the program charter and the project management plan. I'm trying to be methodological agnostic. So I'm not referring to PMBOK, I'm not referring to Prince2, I'm talking to the types of things that you would have. In other words, a charter talks about the contents and the scope and areas like that. The project management plan or program management plan refers to how you're actually going to manage and governance, and it links into all of the other plans that are associated with the particular program that you're working on. So we'll talk about that. The next set that we'll look at is the schedule itself. So we'll say, how does this schedule, how is it going to be controlled? Then we touch on workload and cost. So these are good segues back from Brenton's area. How much effort and cost is required to actually deliver the schedule and deliver the value that we're trying to achieve in this activity that we're doing. Program delivery controls. This is where we start to get in some typical project management things. Are we following the standard project management or program management processes? And finally tonight under program controls, I want to talk about value delivery controls. How's it tracking? How are we managing? How are we going for the value outcomes? This is all about delivering strategy. It's all linked into value. So we'll be focusing on that quite a lot as we go through tonight. So let's look at the first one, charter and PMP, program management. Typically when you're running in a program, you will have a charter and a program management plan for the program itself, and you may have subsets and smaller charters and project management plans for smaller projects, or it may all be embedded in the top one. So I'm only talking in general terms. Now, what sort of things do we expect to see in these? We expect to see, what's the contents, what context of this program that we're doing? What's the scope? What's the value proposition? Why are we actually indeed doing it? What's our focus and our drivers? Is our focus to get to market on time? So, for example, we may be doing something or building something that's throwaway, and that goes against a lot of people that want to make sure that we can build on foundations. We talk about the deliverables, the output that we're actually doing. What's our approach? How are we going to go about it? In there we talk about also our workload and cost and our resources, and also how we're actually going to do the control and the quality of these particular programs or projects within that program. So there's the sorts of things that we're going to talk through as we go. Excuse me for turning pages tonight because the screen is a little bit hard for me to see because my glasses aren't all that crash hot. So what are some of the questions we want to do? What are we looking at? Is the charter and PMP complete? Now, I can't answer this in a short session. What does complete mean? But is it complete? Does it have, quite often you see drafts in there. Quite often you see to be completed or to be advised at a later stage, which is fine. But when you're coming in and looking at it, is it complete? Now, typically in these charter and PMP, you would have some unknowns. The unknowns could be addressed in risks. They could be addressed in assumptions. Do we know what they are? Are they reasonable? So, for example, if we say we don't know how long it's going to take for a supplier to give us this widget, so we're going to assume that it will take us 3 months to get it from once we place the order. Now, is that reasonable? Have we dealt with this supplier before? Is this bleeding edge technology? Is this have to come from overseas? What are the customs impacts as we go through? So you start thinking about the unknowns that have been listed, and are they appropriate? Are they reasonable for this risk-based program? So we need to understand the risks as we go through. The next thing is when we're looking at the charter and the PMP is are they up to date? And are we referring to it? Quite often, and it's a trap for young players, young program managers or project managers diligently develop a fantastic charter and get it approved. They write an incredible PMP or PID documentation or whatever terms we want to use, and they get them approved. But then that's the end of it. They put them in the drawer and say, tick, we've passed that quality gate. We don't need to go back to that quality gate again. Well, guess what? These are the fundamental documents that we as program managers should consistently refer to. We should keep them up to date, and we keep them up to date through change control and change management. Linked into that, do they reflect the true nature? Things may have changed. They may have been approved, but have circumstances changed now, and we're taking a different approach. We're taking different control measures. We're looking at different approaches to deliver the business outcomes. So do these key documents, do they actually reflect the true nature? Then you come and have a chat to the program manager and or the project managers, and just do a little bit of a poll with them. When you're looking at certain paragraphs or chapters in these particular documents, these key fundamental documents, can they actually explain what it is? What's it there for? Can they actually explain why that particular thing is there? What's the significance of it? Why was this approach taken? And if they don't understand that, they really are not in control of this delivery that we're working through. They also need to be able to say to you what the current status is of anything that is mentioned in the charter and in the PMP. If they don't know that, they are not in control. So these are just some fundamental things dealing with the program charter and dealing with the project management plan. Now let's look at the next part we wanted to talk through tonight, which was the schedule control. So what sort of things are we looking at in a schedule? First of all, does the schedule make sense? Once again, you need to understand, you need to apply a common sense rule when you're looking at these sorts of things. Is there a lot of things happening in parallel? Are there incredible durations for certain activities? And that may be correct, but you start posing and understanding why they're doing it. Does it seem to be over-optimistic or pessimistic? For example, they may say, we will get this particular thing approved, or we will have our requirements finalized in 2 days. Well, is that actually real? Do you really think we can do that in 2 days? Or if they say 3 months, well, maybe there's a different way of doing it. 3 months is probably a longish period of time at this point in time in the life cycle of a program. So this is where, when you're looking at it to drive the strategy, the sort of person that would be asking these questions is a very experienced executive or manager who's done a number of programs and delivered programs and or has been a sponsor or an executive on programs before. That's how they'll understand these types of questions. And in our other courses, we go into a little bit more detail of what some of these things mean. The next thing is we start looking at the sequencing. Does the sequencing make sense? And one of the last points I'm going to make on this is from a project on a page or a program on a page. Can you actually see what this looks like on a page? A test that I tend to do with program managers and project managers within a program is ask them to get on the whiteboard. I give them a pen and say, draw this for me. Show me the big chunks of work that you're actually doing. Show me the relationship between those big chunks of work. And by the way, draw the critical path. So which chunks of work are critical? If they don't know that, and if they can't draw that, they're not in control. They don't know what this is all about. If they say, well, let me go to my Microsoft project or Primavera or whatever tool we're using, and I'll print that out for you, no. I would certainly be concerned if that's the case, regardless of the size. Then we look at, so okay, they've done all this scheduling and they've identified some skills, but do they actually have access to them? So they said, yes, we need this skill set, or we need this organization to do this particular package of work at this point in time. Well, are they actually available? Do they know about it? Very fundamental questions that you need to ask. And then you look at the schedule that you've got. Is it actually practical for your organization? Some organizations may have a lot of gestation. There may be a lot of socialization that needs to take place at various points in time. You need to have a lot of communication. Other organizations might be really mature in projects and it's just bulldoze this through. Bang, 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 bang. Everybody knows what they're doing. It's fine. So you've got to match it to the organization. One of the things I talk about in some other subjects is horses for courses. So are things appropriate for that particular program or set of projects that you're working on? Now, this is very interesting. Can you relate the outputs? So quite often that could be a deliverable, or it could be a training package, which of course is a deliverable as well. But can you actually relate the things that you're producing as a program manager or a project manager? How do those things relate to the benefits? Now that presupposes, of course, that you know what the benefits are. And when we start talking into portfolio management and governance, you would certainly be looking at the benefits that are associated. You'd know where the benefits, you would know the interdependencies between the benefits. So does the schedule align to that or not? And if it doesn't, why are you actually even doing the project or the program? Then we start looking at various approvals and quality points, wherever they happen to be. Are they embedded in there? Is there sufficient time for them to do it? And then finally is the point I made before, can the program manager and then the individual project managers draw this on a whiteboard with you sitting there? You just give them a pen and paper. No, they don't even need, they shouldn't need to have any study time. It should be absolutely embedded in their head, and they should know what the critical path is. And I guess I talk a little bit in a non-pure sense. Critical path does change during the life of your project, and don't be afraid that critical path will change. And you'll have critical path to various milestone activities as well. So it's what's critical to get you to whatever point of time you're looking at, whatever cut in the program. So in a small project, it's very straightforward to get a critical path. In a program, your critical path should be aligned to your benefits. So how do you start achieving the benefits as you go through? So there's different aspects and different views of the world as we go through this. And then finally, we need to remember that the schedule is dynamic. Don't let it control you. There's a saying that I picked up many years ago, that a project manager was walking along and then walked into a mountain, and he was questioned, why did you walk into the mountain? And he said, well, my schedule or my map told me that there was a road here. He didn't look up. He didn't use his common sense, his intuition. The schedule is there as a guide. It's dynamic. The outcomes, the things we're trying to achieve to give value to the organization, they are not dynamic. They're absolutely the reason why we're doing this. Now, they may be subject to change, but change in as much as we won't do that particular outcome now because we want to realize these other benefits or priorities have changed. That's a fundamental difference I wanted to bring across. All right, so now let's look at the second one, or the third one, cost estimation. So this is really talking about the change activities that we've got. Sorry, it's talking about, you know, the resources we've got. Do we know who we need? When do we need them? How are we costing them? What's the overall cost? The procurement costs? Do we need people full-time, part-time, etc.? But also we need to make sure that we have actually captured what the ongoing costs are going to be once we've operationalized this particular set of activities that we're doing. So once it's in the normal operational activity, how much is it going to cost ongoing? And those costs can change because of what you have done in the project or program. So you need to be very careful of that and track it as we go through. So once again, the sort of, are the costs realistic? So is it realistic, for example, to do something across the whole organization for $20,000? Is it realistic to do it for $20 million? I can't answer those questions, but the person who's experienced and going through these will have a feel for those types of costs as we go. Quite often on programs that I'm working on, I'll have a gut feel of how much it's going to cost. I certainly don't tell anyone what it is, because as soon as you say an amount or a time, it's just set in the edifice of the program. But you've got to feel, you know, what's the ballpark of this type of activity, because you've done similar types of things before, typically. But anyhow, so is it realistic? And then the time estimates of which that you've used to actually base your costs, are they realistic as well? And when we talk in other subjects in more detail on how do you actually get these time estimates, how do you get these cost estimates, there are a number of techniques that can be used that are quite valid and tend to come up with a fairly accurate answer. And we talk about those in more detail in other subjects. Now we start looking into, you know, what are the bases? So what assumptions have you made for those estimates? What heuristics are you using? Are those valid as we go through? When you're starting to talk about people, because it's people that actually do projects, what level of productivity have you assumed? And you certainly cannot assume 100% productivity, because you can't get it. You shouldn't really, you know, program into the 7 days a week. You may happen to do that sometimes, but you don't program that in. So what is the level of productivity that you're looking at? Is it realistic? How do they come up with those estimates? The people that you've actually got doing the work, Have they reviewed those estimates? Do they still make sense? It's an iterative cycle. Then you start to think about scenarios. Now, what scenarios, and it's part of your risk planning as well, what causes these particular estimates to be exceeded? What could happen to cause that to be exceeded? Now, for example, if you're looking at a cost estimate, it could be the exchange rate could make something change. Or if you're looking at workload, it could be, well, we've estimated this, but when we went to market, the figures were a lot more than we first thought. So we may have thought, for example, someone could have done this for $1.5 million, but they've come up at $1.8 million. And when we go back to them for their best and fairest, we can't really knock it down. So there's things that are out of our control, but we need to understand and think through them and plan for them in advance through our risk planning and risk assessment. Now, when we've got our workload and our cost, are they reliable for going forward? Because a lot of times, and it's unfortunate that people base the success of a project on workload and cost and how you actually got to it, whereas we're looking at our projects and our success by the value that we've delivered. But is that a realistic base to go forward? Or do we need to start refining them and going through them again? You can still work on activities whilst you're refining and going through, and what happens is you tend to give a range of workload and costs as you go through. As your program and projects become more mature and you progress through your life cycle, what you find is your bands or your boundaries of estimates tend to come narrower and narrower and more accurate as we go through. Now, program management should be the activity that we're doing. So as program managers, we're constantly validating these variables, because as I said, as we progress through, they change. We get a much better feel for how it's running. So that's what we do, one of the many things we do as a program manager. Now let's go to the penultimate one in mind, which is looking at program delivery. When we're starting talking about program delivery, we're really looking at tracking and managing things like risks and issues and progress against the deliverables and resource usages and alignment of stakeholders, etc., etc. These are the sort of things we talk about. So a little bit more than triple constraint that I saw someone raise before. Well, actually much broader than triple constraint, but that is never forgotten when we're going through. So what are some of the things that we start to look at? So are these things, are the risks, are the issues, are the deliverable matrix that we've got, our resource utilization, are they actually being managed or just registered? A lot of times people diligently do some great risk assessment, but then they don't manage the risks. They may, for example, think, oh, we've got a steering committee coming up in the next couple of weeks, we've better review our risks so that we've got an update on the risks for our steering committee. That is not how you control a project. Each risk would have a different timing of when you're actually reviewing them. A risk might be reviewed at a certain milestone, or it might be reviewed every day. It depends on where we are and what the risk is. With issues, are we actually really managing them, or we're using issue lists as just a to-do list? If something is an issue and it's been open for 3 months, why? Who's managing it? Should it still be there? Quite often you see in issues, for example, someone may have written an issue down, but it's spawned into multiple issues. So you close the original one, refer back to it, but close it, and then open up all these other new issues, the smaller ones that you can work on. And we talk in a bit of detail in other subjects about the differences between issues and risks and how we manage them. So the key point here is, are we just registering them, putting them into a log, or are we actively and aggressively managing them? The answer is we should be actively and aggressively managing them. Now, on the risks and issues, does the program manager and the project managers, for that sake, do they know what's the most critical? And are those critical ones being addressed and resolved? Having 100 risks is meaningless. Do you know what's the most critical? Your issues. What are your top 3 issues? don't you hate it, for example, if you're thinking you're doing a fantastic job and there's a new executive comes into the organization, they say, hey, what are your top 3 risks, or what are your top 3 issues? If you don't know them, they'll start to suspect your your capabilities. You need to, as program managers, it's in your brain all the time. That's what you wake up with constantly. What are the top things? What am I going to do about them? How am I going to address them? Now, when we're looking at measures and controls from a perspective of delivering the strategy, successfully delivering the strategy, so are we on track of delivering these outcomes? Poses the question, do we know what the outcomes are? We tackle that in portfolio and governance, but do we know what these outcomes are that we're supposed to achieve? Yes, we've got some outputs. We have some deliverables. And we said before that what's the association of those to the benefits? The benefits are linked to the outcomes, and the value is linked to the benefits. So that's sort of how it all falls together. Now, stakeholders, stakeholder management, and then once again it's a whole night talking about those and other subjects. But are the stakeholders where we need them to be? Are they stakeholders that just let things happen? Are they stakeholders that we need them to be actively engaged, or just to be informed? Or do they want to have their finger in every pie and they're actually quite a nuisance? We need to know all of our stakeholders, and we need to know where we need them to be for us to be successful. And if they're not where they need to be, what strategies do we have in place for actually achieving that? And it's different for every stakeholder. More on that and other subjects. And finally, what we do as program management, we constantly measure the outputs. We measure the outputs to make sure that we're delivering the outcomes, to achieve the benefits, to get the value, the dollar value. That's what we do in program management. Finally, tonight, I just want to talk a little bit on, if it comes through, Brenton, you may have to take the next slide. Sorry, man. Thank you. The last thing I want to talk about is value delivery. So we talked about value. So value, as I said, you've got your outcomes, you've got your benefits. You have, from the benefits, you can have a value or a dollar amount to them. And of course, how do you get your dollar amount? You do that through variables associated with each of the dollar amounts. More on that in another topic. But are we consistently delivering to the schedule? Because if we're not, every day delay causes a loss to the benefits. So we're doing this project for the benefits, for the value. So if our project, for example, goes $3 million over budget, yep, the project manager may get a slap on the wrists and naughty, we'll give you the money because we really need to do this project. But have we looked, is that extra $2 million or whatever it is over budget, how's that going to impact the net value? Should we actually even keep going? Because every dollar we need over and above what's been approved when we look through the business case and the value proposition, it reduces the net value of this particular investment. In other words, the activities that we're doing, we're spending money to achieve something, every dollar we're over, it reduces the net value. Is it still worth it? Now, if the projects or programs aren't, why aren't they? What are we going to do about it? How are we going to do it? And then the final thing we look at is, will they still meet the needs and expectations of the stakeholders? I think I may have mentioned it last week, the operation was a success, but the patient died. In other words, and Brenton was talking about it too, 10% isn't working, that may mean the whole lot's not working. So we need to think through all of that as we go through. Now, Brenton, I think there may be one more slide on that. Thank you. So we're really looking at strategic outcomes, and it's the strategic outcomes of program management that we're looking at to deal with the value. So this is what it's all about, guys. All right, that's what I wanted to talk about, and happy now to open up to questions and then hand back through to Brenton. So are there any questions coming through, please?
Well, I'll give everyone a pause to throw. We haven't got any questions as yet. Thanks for that, Phil. That's an excellent rundown of the control mechanisms and the questions that need to be asked from a program perspective. Just while we're waiting to see if anyone does have any questions from what we've just covered or any of the points that Philip has raised, I'll just go back a step to a question that Talika raised about quality assurance and quality control and how that relates to the monitoring and evaluation of program activities. And I think there's probably two different ways that this question could be tackled. One is at a conceptual level, which is sort of how we've talked about QA and QC already, tried to conceptually position those. And if we talk about monitoring and evaluation, well, you would need a certain amount of monitoring and evaluation feedback into both of those. So you'd need to have monitoring and evaluation of what the quality assurance is yielding in terms of results to be able to know whether or not any changes are necessary to quality assurance methods and standards, etc. And quality control is something that you'd need to be able to pull that information out of. Now, if you look at it from a methodology point of view in this question, if you look at the Project Management Institute, their body of knowledge on project management talks about quality assurance and quality control in a much more conceptual sense of what we've already discussed. But if you look at their body of knowledge on program management, the distinction that they make between quality assurance and quality control is to say that quality assurance is much more of an overhead view of program management, trying to make sure that the projects, the component projects, have what they need in terms of requirements and objectives and everything. Whereas in quality control, it talks about it in a much more specific project basis. So it's looking at quality control as a way of looking at the individual outcomes from each individual component project and say, did this outcome meet the quality requirements or not? And if not, what are we going to do about it? So it still follows the philosophy. It still places quality control as the reactive certainty mechanism, but it's suggesting that quality control is much more about looking at the individual outcomes coming from the component projects that feed back into the program overall strategic objectives. Now, we have got a couple of questions come in, which I'll throw back to you, Philip. Ray said, can earned value techniques be used in program management?
Yeah, thanks for that. Ray, can they be used in program management? Well, yes, they can. Earned value are useful tools. So we're really talking here about earned value with respect to the schedule and progress on the schedule, as long as you have all the information put into the schedules, you can actually work on earned value. What I find in programs, however, it is quite difficult to use earned value. The project by a project, it's fine if that's the control measure that you'd like to use, or a reporting measure that you want to use to see how you're progressing. But if you're looking at it from a program level, and if you understand the formulas for earned value, they're actually roll-ups. So when you have a lot of projects running under a program, you start to roll up, and you may indeed miss very near critical path activities as a result of roll-up. So yes, you can use it, and you can use it as a guide, but I tend to focus on other control measures more than earned value when I'm looking at program management. And I see there's one more question there that I can see on my screen that I'll answer, then I need to go to another appointment, so I do apologize for that. But Simon was asking about the link between outcome, benefits, and value. Well, I'll give you my perspective on that, Simon. When I use the word outcome, I'm referring to a statement that is written in business terms as if it has already happened. So it's a statement in the future. So an outcome, for example, could be we answer all of our customer calls within 3 rings. That's an outcome. It's written in the as if it's happened, and you're able to actually answer, look at an outcome and assess it with a straight yes, no. So did we achieve that, yes or no? There's no grey areas. So a very simple concept, but it's in business terms. Now, for each outcome in a project or a program, there would be a series of benefits associated with them. And typically the benefit there would be the sorts of things that you tend to see in projects where they have bullet points. These are our objectives. You know, we're going to minimize paperwork, blah, 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 blah. quite useless really. But if you look at it from an outcome perspective, what benefits do we get by answering a call within 3 rings? We can start to articulate those. So what competitive advantage are we going to get as a result from doing it? What's the impact on the customers? What's the impact on our flow-throughs? What's our call volume? So you can start looking at benefits for each outcome. Don't think about everything, just that one outcome. Then for each of those benefits, you can then associate a dollar value for those benefits. So for example, if we're able to address more customers in a particular given period of time, what value is that to us? And we can give a dollar value, and then that would be dependent on the variables. So a variable or a value driver could be, what's the cost per call? What's the cost per customer? What's the saving per customer? So we've got all these variables that we put in to create a value if we've achieved that benefit. The drivers or the variables can change through time. The benefit doesn't change. The value changes because of the variables. So outcome, business terms, have we achieved it? Yes, no. For each outcome, the benefits in words, and for each of those benefits, what's the associated dollar value to the organisation? So when we say if a project or a program starts to run over, the net impact on the value will certainly change, and the variables will change over time. So for example, if we don't hit something by the end of a financial year, that may have a huge impact on the value of this particular program of work that we're doing. So I hope that answered the question. Cool. Thank you, guys. I need to sign off. My apologies, Brenton, and everyone that's listening in. I hope
Thank
to
you, Philip.
have
We're just about to wrap up.
Conversation next week. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks for joining in. Thanks for your contribution. And yes, Philip, we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Now, for everyone else, we've just got the summary to wrap up before we close off for tonight. The points that we've covered already, we've talked about the time and resources in general. We've talked about why some of these need to be managed, should be managed, how are they managed at the program level. We've talked about how the different perspectives that programs have on things like the money, that the different demands on programs about money. It's not just about, here's the money, how are we going to spend it? There's a lot more to it than it talks about the budget, the cash flow, the timing, the actual cost of money, the funding decisions, the empowerment of the funding organisations. All of these elements influence how programs deal with the funding and the budgetary requirements. Then we talked about quality, and if you link that back to the interesting value that came out of the poll, that only a very small percentage of your organizations or the people that you work with focus as value being the most important outcome. Sorry, as quality being the most important outcome. Whereas in many programs, if you look at it from the point of view of what the program is there to achieve, if the quality fails, then the entire program may have failed. And so by having a true and full appreciation at the program level of what quality is really all about for the program, hopefully some of you might be able to influence some of the people that you're working with and have them perhaps have a greater appreciation of the true importance and value of quality. And of course the program controls that we've just heard from with Philip, some of the very key elements of what we need to think about and how in practical terms we need to control the activities and the questions and the answers in order to deliver the value that are needed. And the last quote is from Martin Villeneuve, who's a Canadian screenwriter and producer and director. His take on this whole idea of constraints is that he says problems are hidden opportunities and constraints can actually boost creativity. The point here is that until we truly understand the constraints with which we are operating, we don't get the full opportunity to embrace the creativity that helps and makes us think about how we're going to make the best out of what we actually have to work with, rather than hoping and wishing that we had more or expecting that we might get more. Now that wraps up everything we've got to cover tonight. If anyone does have any other questions that we haven't dealt with, please throw them up on the forums. That's the great place to put them there. We'll make sure that we get answers, and we'll be back again next week to talk about some new things regarding the difference between programs, and we'll talk a lot more about portfolios next week. And there'll be a few more things to listen to on the portal between now and then. In the meantime, thanks very much for tuning in. Thanks for all your comments, contributions, and questions. And until next week, that's all from us. For now, thank you and good night.